My name is Gary Johnston. I'm the owner of Jaycar Electronics and a number of associated companies. We are basically in the Australian New Zealand region in a retail sense, and we've got about 70 plus stores. We primarily sell non-consumer merchandise, products that hobbyists and professional electronic users need to conduct their business, and we've been going for 29 years. My interest in electronics started when I was about 12 years of age, and I started with crystal sets and that sort of stuff. I went on to building valve equipment. Transistors were in their infancy in those days, and they were expensive, and valves were much more commonplace, so we worked with valve equipment. And I used to make guitar amplifiers for my schoolmates, and the money I made from that, I bought my first car. The amplifiers probably cost me at least as much as what I sold them for, so I learned some valuable lessons there, but it was a forced saving, I suppose. My first car was only 50 quid. You know, I also bred small tropical fish, guppies, and sold those. I think there was quite an entrepreneurial spirit amongst people. Not all of my mates were as entrepreneurial as me, but there was a bit of it. We had a bit of a radio club at high school. There were a number of kids who were pretty bright, and we learnt from each other. The hobby magazines that were around at the time would give you a lot of assistance, but we were bright kids. We basically picked the principles up pretty easily. I was always good in the physical sciences. I've been attracted to an interest in the physical nature of the world ever since I can remember. I started through a friendship at high school, and a mate of mine who I grew up with in Sydney's what's now called the Inner West, and he was interested in electronics. Indeed, that person went on and did an engineering degree, and he is in fact our technical director of Jaycar Electronics, Brian Chilcott. Been a friend all my life. We experimented a bit. You know, nothing's going to blow up in a crystal set, it doesn't even have a battery. But valve amplifiers with power supplies that are in several hundred volts, we had some spectacular moments. But fortunately, I'm still here to this day. Connecting the crystal set together and connecting it to an antenna through a little crystal earpiece was what I call, or what people would call, an epiphany. To hear a jumble of radio stations come out of what looks like just a few wires twisted together, I found that astonishing. In fact, I found it a life-changing experience, and I thought, I have to know more about this. To be able to get intelligible information, including music, out of thin air, I thought was as close to magic as you can get. And I believed from that very day that there is something miraculous about the concept of radio. To be able to transmit from one place to another through thin air, through the vacuum of space, intelligible information, I still find that astonishing. And that's what got me right there. My interest in electronics has not diminished, but that's what got me. And my interest then went to hi-fi and audio, amplifiers, speakers, sound reproduction generally, and I didn't become a ham radio person, but I could have, but I didn't pursue that activity, and but my knowledge in electronics is quite broad. Well, most people were learning to ride surfboards. the nerdy people, of which Bill Gates has made us all very respectable, were always looked at as the people who really either didn't have the physical skills to go out and play cricket or tennis or football or surf, and the great bulk of people were doing that. The people who were involved in electronics were generally making amplifiers of some description or another. I remember quite clearly that a resistor from Mellor Brothers in Railway Parade, Burwood, cost 1 shilling, which was a huge amount of money. It's 10 cents now in today's money, but we couldn't afford to buy components that cost that. And a mate of mine and I used to scavenge on the local tip where O'Donnell Griffin, which was a company back in the 60s that repaired television sets, used to throw a lot of their scrap electronics out. And we scavenged through that tip and found radio valves that were 90% spent, but not completely spent. And we built our stuff out of things that we could just scavenge off the tip. I look back on my days as a scavenger with a great deal of warmth, because everything was free and you could just walk onto the tip. There was no occupational health and safety rules, and we used to stand in piles and piles of broken equipment and glass and bits and pieces of, I'm sure, very noxious chemicals. And we'd come back with a billy cart loaded up with rubbish, and we'd then go through that, and with that basically free surplus equipment, we'd build whatever we wanted to build. Oh, look, these days you see on council clean-up days bicycles that are only a couple of years old. I mean, nothing was thrown out in the 60s. Nothing was thrown on the front lawn for the council to come along and get. We live in a much more consumptive era now, and if I was a kid, I'd have a wonderful time just going around the suburbs at clean-up time, collecting old VCRs and all sorts of technology, because there's so much technology now that's disposed of that I would have been able to reuse. Stepping motors, all sorts of electronics, and but nobody's interested anymore. It has no value. I'm a personal mate of Dick Smith, and he never really played any sport or had any interest in sport. But I had a pretty normal sporting upbringing. I played football and did all sorts of things. So I stretched across the normal childhood upbringing, and also with an interest in electronics. The people who were interested in electronics were basically just bright people who wanted to learn things. They just wanted to learn things. There wasn't the availability of equipment in the 60s, which is particularly the era, the decade where I did a lot of this stuff. There just isn't. Everything's available now. You can just go into a shop and buy it. Yeah. You couldn't buy a hi-fi speaker system in the 60s. You had to build it yourself. There was a lot. The whole radio boom occurred after the Second World War, and probably a little bit earlier than that, where if you wanted to buy a radio, it would cost you 6 months' wages. And you could build it yourself for probably 6 weeks' wages. And having a radio at home was considered a pretty flash thing to do. And when television came along, television sets were very expensive, even modest ones. Now you can buy a television set in a supermarket. It's unbelievable. They've just become so commonplace. Electronics is a mind game. The people who understand electronics by definition have to be pretty bright. There are some concepts in electronics that are difficult to get around. You know, radio propagation is a difficult concept, and there's a bit of maths involved, but there's a bit of physics, so you've got to be that way inclined. There were a lot of electronic component suppliers around in the 60s, indeed far more than now. One of the sad things about now is that the guys that came back from the Second World War, who started up radio shops, as they call them, who basically sold World War II surplus, they've all died, and they really didn't have the managerial capacity to start up chains of stores. And this is where Dick Smith came along in the very late 60s, early 70s, and started up Dick Smith Electronics, and he had the management ability to have more than one shop. And then all of a sudden the availability of components was democratised enormously. But that didn't stop Dick or me, or thousands of others, from going to these little shops in Enmore and all sorts of little nooks and crannies and ratting through their rather untidy shops and getting what we want, and a lot of good free advice too, for that matter, from these people. But they've all gone. In the old days there was a lot more of that because there was a lot more junk around. There was a lot more junk. It was good junk. There was good junk. And you'd see something for a very modest amount of money and you'd buy it and take it home, and you would cannibalise it, you would dismantle it and get lots of goodies out of it. But what you did, of course, is that you didn't charge yourself for your own labour. So you might spend 10 or 15 hours pulling it apart and lovingly cataloguing all of the parts that you got. So you regarded that as a bargain, but commercially that's just not possible, of course. There was virtually no unemployment. When I remember at school that I was written, the banks all wrote to high school students, Qantas, and I went to see Qantas when I was about 16 or 17 with my mum, and they said, look, when you leave, just come and see us, we'll give you a job. I was looking at doing a career as a flight engineer. I didn't particularly at the time see myself as pursuing my hobby, which I regarded as a hobby, and turning it into a career. That came later. I sort of fell into it. But the fact is that there was no unemployment. I started my career with Philips, the Dutch electronics company, working in their component division. I then went to a company called Plessy, who are a large English multinational, and they bought out an Australian family-owned company called the Jukon Condenser Company. A condenser is an old-fashioned term for capacitor. And they were out at Villawood, and they had about 3,000 employees, and it was a marvellous place to work. They made every type of electronic component. Everything was made in Australia in those days. They made ferrite, they made transistors, they made diodes, they made every type of capacitor, from tiny little ones to huge ones that go in power stations. They had a 3 million volt testing laboratory. They had an ultrasonic swimming pool for testing ultrasonic devices. They made all manner of things, including military hardware. It was a great place to work. It was just a great, and I was given the run of the place. It was marvellous. And then I went to work for an electronic component distributor, which is still around. And then I went overseas for a while, and then I came back and worked for Dick. The thing that made Dick Smith different to everybody else is that he produced a catalogue, and it enabled people to determine what they needed in advance of actually going to the shop. There was a shop in Clarence Street in Sydney where you had to go, called George Brown & Co, and it was in a basement, and all of the people who served you were in grey dust coats, and you had to go down the steps and grab a number as you went, like a pastry shop now, and stand there for 20 minutes and ask these people, who were rather resentful types, because they didn't want to deal with 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds. They felt that they were professionals and they should only deal with professionals. And you had to know what you were doing. You had to know what to ask for. So by producing a catalogue, people could spend all of their time saying, oh, do I buy this or do I buy that? And how much is this and how much is that? I really only need this, so I'll buy that. And you write out your little list on the back of an envelope, and you go in and you get served. And we do exactly that in Jaycar Electronics, just like they did in Dick Smith Electronics. Well, when I was working for the component distributor, Dick Smith in those days had one shop, and he was still installing car radios. That's how he started. and it came up for me to go and visit him, and we got on. I still have the diary that I entry for, and I sold him a number of things, and he said, well, why would I buy this from you? And I said, look, I'm not going to sell you anything that's no good to you. I'm not going to turn you into a museum. I'll sell you something that you'll sell and make profit out of it. You'll love me. You'll want to buy more, and you'll get confidence in me, and you will continue to buy products from me. I won't load you up with junk. And I looked him squarely in the eye. And I promptly forgot about that. And then I went overseas for nearly 3 years. And I came back, and we had the oil crisis and the massive recession that occurred while Gough Whitlam was in power. And the company that I worked for in the early 70s said to me when I left, come back and we'll give you your job back. And I thought nothing more of it. I came back at the end of 1974 at Christmas time, just when Cyclone Tracy struck, and they said, look, we don't have any work. And I was astonished. I was looking for the first time in my life, at the age of 24, at having to go on the dole or look for a job. Never occurred to me in my young life. But Dick Smith heard that I was back, and he, through a friend, contacted me and said, oh, look, I've been quite successful in the time you've been away. I said, well, what are you interested in me for? And he said that the time that I last saw him was when I sold him some goods, soldering irons and the like, and he repeated what I'd said to him at the time, which I'd forgotten, that I wouldn't sell him things that he couldn't sell. And he said, look, I want you to do that for me. And it wasn't quite that job. He wanted me to actually get involved in importing goods from what was then Japan. There was no Taiwan, there was no China. And so in the absence of any other job offers, I went to work for Dick. And it was the best career decision I ever made, because Dick and I had a lot of fun. We did some very crazy non-electronic things like fly planes to the South Pole. But I learnt a lot about his intuitive business, business instincts. And I couldn't figure him out at first, But over 7 years I worked him out. And I've worked out his intuitive thought processes actually do have a structure. And after a long time, and I was happy to work for him, but after a while he wanted to leave and go into another career. I decided that I thought I knew the business at least as well as he did, and I started Jaycar up, and as it turned out, I was right. He's a very different person to me. He's a sprinter. He can put an enormous amount of energy into anything for a fairly short period of time, and I'm more a middle distance man. And he can't understand, for example, why I'm still doing what I'm doing. And he has the ability and talent to have more than one career in a lifetime. Alas, most of us just do the same thing until we get our gold watch. I'm happy to keep doing what I'm doing. It continues to interest me. And I have an abiding love in electronics, so it's probably no less than Dick's. But probably Dick has some other interests that interest him at least as much, and they don't interest me as much. What we did with Jaycar is just use the Dick Smith 1970s business plan and just keep doing it over and over and over again. So an electronic enthusiast can walk into a Jaycar store, and if they're old enough, they can say, this is what Dick Smith Electronics used to be like. And I'm sure if you're an American and you walked into a 1960s Radio Shack, or what they call them in Australia, Tandy store, they would have said the same thing. There was a focus on components and technical hardware. But what happens with a lot of businesses, including Radio Shack and including Dick Smith Electronics, is the owners of the business decide that they want to chase a consumer dollar because electronic enthusiasts are not numerous. In fact, they're a shrinking part of our business. Computerisation and computers as a hobby took a lot of electronic enthusiasts away, because people who are interested in sitting down, leading a sedentary sort of life but using their minds, can sit in front of a keyboard. They don't have to use a soldering iron. So we lost a lot of enthusiasts there. And Dick Smith Electronics management decided that they should sell mobile phones and all sorts of modern consumer goods. And Jaycar has decided to stay in that traditional area but still pursue electronics at a much more technical level. When I left Dick Smith's, I left them with 3 very, very successful publications. The people who followed didn't do anything to upgrade them. They basically just reprinted them, and that was fine. I decided to do a similar thing with Jaycar Electronics, and we have what we call our short circuits theories. Our short circuits books are very, very popular. Indeed, I think they've largely taken over from Funway, mainly because Dick Smith Electronics spent no effort in upgrading the product, and the short circuits books recognise emerging technology which the Dick Smith product didn't. That's no criticism of Dick Smith. He'd left by that time, but the product introduced a lot of people into electronics. When I was at Dickies, there were about 2,000 SKUs, stock keeping units, products. We have about 9,000. The world of choice is something that's never going to be simplified. You can have everything in right or left-handed, pink, blue, puce, cream, beige, off-white, etc. And choice is something that is endless. It's a bottomless pit. We try to keep some sort of a lid on it in order to keep our warehouse from exploding at the seams. But yes, the world is a more complicated place. There was no such thing as a GPS receiver, or a computer for that matter, in 1975. I'm a bit of a one-trick pony. I learned an awful lot at Dick Smith Electronics, and it worked very, very well. Made Dick Smith a lot of money. There were some fundamental lessons to be learnt there, and I'm not going to go into all of them because they can be quite complex. But the fact is that when Dick sold out, the company was starting to steer away from its hobbyist roots. And I decided that in order for Jaycar to survive as a business is to stay under the radar from the very large Woolworths owned Dick Smith Electronics, because the executives there could easily have crushed me if I tried to take them head on. So I decided to do things that they didn't particularly care much about anymore, and that was to keep servicing the hobby enthusiast market and possibly go up a little bit up market to Dick Smith Electronics. So we did that. We did slightly different kits. We did kits that were more complex than Dick Smith Electronics, and they couldn't crush us by saying, we'll sell whatever Jaycar sell, we'll sell for half the price or something, because they didn't have the product, or they didn't have quite the way that we did it. So we stayed out of the crosshairs, and that worked extremely well. There was still a lot to be left in the hobby market. So we took a long time to get... See, when I left Dick Smith Electronics, they only had 14 stores. And we got to about 6 stores in the first few years. And I had a pretty good life as a result of that. You know, we had enough money to pay our bills every month. But the nature of capitalism is you expand and you expand and you expand. Whilst we still are very much a business like Dick Smith Electronics, we're still a very different business to what Dick Smith Electronics was. Basically, the electronics manufacturing industry uses, because they're driven by different vectors, they're driven by cost of manufacturing. Electronic manufacturers use electronic components that don't have wire leads. They are what's called surface mount components. And to manufacture a piece of equipment, it's very difficult to get a robot to put wires through a circuit board. It's like threading a needle through a button. So over the last 20 years, if you just drop the component on the board in an environment where lead solder is in the form of a vapour, the thing will just sweat onto the circuit board. And this takes a lot of labour out of it and makes for high-speed manufacturing, where electronic enthusiasts still like to thread the component through the board and solder it. So we carry a range of wire-leaded components. They used to be just called components, but we have to differentiate between the two. And they're very old-fashioned components these days. You just never see them in manufacture anymore. And so the type of components that are in industry and the type of components that hobbyists use are very electrically they're identical, but physically they're different. But manufactured goods these days basically are focused down on larger and larger degrees of integration in the one big chip. If you look in your computer, the chip in your computer is about 25 millimetre square and has about 160 tiny little bumps around it, and that's the microprocessor. Well, that degree of sophistication inside one part is not necessary for hobby electronics. We still carry the same range of parts that we carried 25 years ago. I think actually, but I don't really know, but I think we're actually a better trainer than Dick Smith Electronics. We actually, if somebody comes and works for us, some young person, 18, 19, they've left school, they've done their higher school certificate, and they don't really know what they want to do at uni or whether they want to become a bricklayer or something, but they're electronic enthusiasts and they come and work for us for a few years. We feel that we've got an obligation to give them some sort of training, and we have a TAFE qualified, approved retail management training system. So whether they stay with us for the rest of their lives or whether they move on, they go away with a nationally recognised certificate which teaches them the fundamentals of retailing operations. Not necessarily in electronics. We encourage them to learn electronics. We have fairly high standards of product knowledge in the company, and our testimonial file bulges with people saying, "I love your staff, they're so knowledgeable," which is a difficult thing to get these days. But yes, we believe fundamentally in training people. As people choose to buy things via the internet, it will become a competitor. Our own company has a website that's quite substantial in anticipation of this. It's only about 3% of our business, 4% of our business at the moment, which is in line with Australian average retail business. I note that Meyer and David Jones have got back into selling goods on the internet. David Jones actually shut their website down in 2003, I think it was, because it was losing money. Jerry Harvey from Harvey Norman has been quite critical of the internet. I think that some things will sell well. I think Amazon's clever in selling books over the internet, but I don't think I'll ever buy an avocado over the internet. I'd like to give it a little squeeze, and there is some merit in the internet, but not in everything, but probably a lot of our stuff. See, the problem with electronic components is that it's a bottomless pit. We've got competitors who keep 160,000 components online. They're usually US distributors, and they only get away with it because they operate out of a warehouse in the middle of Texas using cheap Mexican labour in telephone sales and a high degree of computerised logistical sophistication. That can work internationally because you might sell 300 or 400 of those different microcontrollers all over the world at fairly high markups too. They're not cheap, but it works. I mean, if you want a particular type of field programmable gate array, FPGA, everything's abbreviated. You can buy from these people. Might cost you 30, 40, $50. Might take 10 days, 2 weeks to get there, but you'll get it. Just like you can get a spare part for an aircraft engine that's 40 years old. You can still get it. There's inventory for everything ever manufactured still around. The Arduino was developed in Italy through an educational institution. It's got merits. Because it's open source doesn't actually mean much. Linux is an open source computer language, but in order to get a really good one, you usually pay for the IBM version because it's more refined. It doesn't really mean much if something is open source. It's sort of nice, but it doesn't really mean much. The Arduino is interesting. I think if it was going to be wildly successful, it would have been so by now. We follow that sort of thing, but there generally are specialist retailers who are better at it than us, and they only ever get to about 4 or 5 employees, and they work over their mum's garage, and they give very high levels of service compared to the sales they make. We can't be good at everything, but if you want to buy an Arduino board with all the components, with the various expansion accessories, you can buy it from us. A lot of those small microcontroller projects are solutions looking for problems. There isn't a problem. I mean, the Arduinos tend to have an application in robotics, amateur robotics, XY plotters, those sort of things. There's an awful lot of heavy-duty process control hardware out there made by people like NEC. You can buy it out of a box. We've got a company with about 120 people sell that stuff every day. If you're an industrial customer, you can't afford to muck around with Arduino. You buy something out of a box. Industrial controller, ladder logic, just touch screen, everything, all the software's embedded in it. It connects up to RS-232. You can turn a factory on and off with it remotely across the world. The Arduino, you could do that, but you need a nerd to do it for about 6 months, and he may or may not deliver. The Arduino's a hobby product, trying to do an industrial job. There's the pickaxe system, British English system, which is very good. There's quite a lot of that stuff around. The parallax stamp, a lot of this stuff comes out of the States. We subscribe to all these magazines. We stay right across all that stuff. And I was watching Arduino, and I personally put it into the company because I thought this could be a winner. And whether it remains in our product range, I don't know. I suspect that people who become real Arduino fans end up buying everything they need on the net and bypassing us. We're mindful of the way other companies have gone. What tends to happen with companies like Jaycar is that they're started by an entrepreneur who's an electronics enthusiast, and they go on and they either go broke or they kick on and become substantial businesses. And then they get taken over by a large corporation, either a larger retailer or a merchant bank or investors. And then another generation of management comes through, and they don't have the cultural feel of the business. For example, resistors. We carry 1/4 watt, 1/8 watt, 1 watt, 10 watt resistors in about 300 different electrical resistance values. If you're an executive and you only understood number crunching, you'd say, why do we have to keep 1 meg resistors? We hardly ever sell them. Why don't we just sell the 47K and the 10K and the 4.7K? But you can't do that. You've got to carry the whole range. It's like a hardware store not carrying all the nuts and bolts, between 1/8 of an inch and 1/2 an inch. It's ridiculous. But that's what they say, because it's a reasonable thing to ask if you don't understand the business. And what happens is that people who don't understand the business run the business. So slowly, like the death of 1,000 cuts, they change the nature of the business. They say, if we got rid of tantalum capacitors, we could carry more mobile phones. And I understand that is the process. And whilst I am the proprietor of this business, we'll either be in components or we won't. Nothing in between. And I see no reason why we should discontinue our core range of components so that electronic enthusiasts have got somewhere to go and buy parts. Because yes, Dick Smith have got out of electronic components. When I found that out, I had extreme mixed feelings because I didn't think it'd do us much good. It just diminishes the whole market. The whole market just shrinks slightly. And at this stage, our cultural fundamentals will not change. If I get run over by a bus tomorrow, there are people in this company who know my cultural beliefs very, very well. And I can't guarantee in 50 years, when there's several generations of management, but at this stage we won't change because we're very successful. And when you're successful, you become much more conservative about change, because the likelihood of change is you're more likely to stuff it up than make it any better. So you become more conservative. Now that in itself is a poison chalice, because it might mean that you slowly die. But if you maintain a vigorous part of your business, like our component range hasn't changed much at all, but we sell a lot of other products. What happens is our component part of our business becomes a smaller and smaller part of our business, but it's still a very valuable part of our business. It's a very profitable part of our business. We won't get out of it. A very large part of our business is, for example, the world of USB, the very, very popular computer interface, powered computer interface called USB. And we sell an enormous amount of hardware that operates via a USB port. That has been a wonderful, wonderful part of our business. So if you look in a Jaycar catalogue, there's 20 and 30 pages of products that are basically USB hardware. And computers in many ways has been a great saviour for Jaycar. If we were just a business selling components, we'd probably still have only 6 stores. We certainly wouldn't be operating on 5 hectare warehouse space. Wireless technology, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, the home cinema, high resolution HDMI connection system has been very good for us. We are very, very fast into getting into new hardware on a peripheral basis. You won't see a plasma TV for sale in Jaycar, but everything else you can buy from us. So you go to the big high street retailers and they will fight tooth and nail to get your plasma TV business, but we'll do the rest, thank you very much. We'll make it work in the real world for you. Rather than spending $500 on some ridiculously expensive HDMI cable or speaker wire, you can come to us and pay a third or quarter of that price and get one just as good, and get plenty of technical advice as well. The people who work for Jaycar are self-defining. They're interested in electronics. They don't go and work for high street retailers because you don't have to have any knowledge to be in that environment. But to work in our environment, to understand about USB at a very technical level, you're going to have no use in that electrical environment where you're selling a washing machine one minute and a TV the next. But you know that if you're working for us, you're going to be constantly confronted with technical questions. The high street retailers send people to us because the moment they get asked a curly one, they go, oh, you better go and see Jaycar about that. They're our best friends. I had my soldering iron out last weekend because I still love fiddling. But I'm going to be building a water level meter shortly, which is a Jaycar kit, because I'm building a new house, and I've got some underground storage tanks, and I want to know what their water level is, and Jaycar has a kit, and I will solder it together and I will commission it, and there'll be a little row of LEDs that'll show me how much water's in the tank, and I'll build it and I'll enjoy it and I'll install it, then I'll forget that I've ever did it, but I'll get the benefit from it for the rest of my life. The fact is that there are some people who just love to know how things work, and there are some people who don't care but are very clever knowing how to operate a computer. I'm not that good with a computer because I just don't find them so seductive. I understand what a shift register does in a computer, but I don't care to endlessly tap away at the keyboard. That's just the way it is.